All right, well, welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about a couple of different things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is this year's 911 governing body data collection effort. We do this every year. This year's a little bit different because state statute starting that went into effect last year now gives us a little bit more gives us purposes for collecting the data. It does make it mandatory as well for the governing bodies to respond, even though it doesn't provide any penalties or anything like that for not responding. But we're hoping that we get a very complete data collection this year because of that. So I'll be sending that out. But first, I want to go through the form with everybody and show everybody what the questions are, talk about the reasons for the questions, what kind of information we're expecting to get back from those different questions. I think that people will find that it's not really more difficult than the ones we've done in the past, but we're hoping to get as close to a complete set of data as we can, and this data is used for different purposes that I'll be talking about. And then the second half of the webinar today, we'll be talking about how to apply for an emergency telephone charge increase. And I know a lot of the people who are watching this from the different 911 authorities across the state have probably filed for an emergency telephone charge increase before, but there are personnel changes, there are staff changes at the local level, so the people who did it before may not be around anymore. So this is intended to help people in the future if they want to apply. And also because over the last few years, we have implemented a new emergency telephone charge application form to make the process a little easier for you. So we're going to be going through that form and talking about the different types of material that we request as part of an emergency telephone charge application. Some of it is request and some of it is actually required in commission rules. And we'll also be talking about some best practices regarding applications and what type of information would really helps your application move forward. We can't provide, there's no secret formula for if you put this in your application, it will definitely be approved or anything along those lines. But we're going to be providing you with an overview of the form itself and talking about what types of things might help your application through the process. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started on this this data collection form, unless anybody has any questions or comments before we get started. And as always, when I do a presentation, I tell people don't wait till the end to ask questions. If you have a question relevant to what I'm talking about, go ahead and ask, because if you have that question, there's a good chance that somebody else might have the same question. So let's go ahead and keep it going. Let me resize this window as I share it, make it a little easier. Can everybody read that okay? Can anybody not read it? Can I make it, I don't know if I can make this bigger or not.
Looks good to me.
All right. So over the next week, I'm going to be sending these out. Every 911 governing body contact in the state will receive a copy of this form. As we have done in the past when we were doing these in conjunction with the Colorado 911 Resource Center, the data will automatically be filled in for your 911 governing body. The idea is that we don't want you to have to fill this form out from scratch every year. So data we already have will be in the form. There's some data that will change every year, so we ask you to go through and update those fields. And then if anything else has changed, like contact information, we ask you to update that as well. So the idea is to make it as easy on you as possible. That's why it's pre-filled or pre-populated with your existing data. If you get a form, or if you somehow get to the form and it's blank, that means you're not using the right link. If you use the right link for your 911 authority, it will automatically be pre-populated. So if you get the form and it's blank, just send me an email so I can send you the correct link to the form. Another thing I want to point out, and I mentioned it here in the instructions, is that you can fill this form out in multiple sessions. You just have to click submit at the end to save your data, but don't click complete. Did I include a complete? Yes, I did. So we have a question at the end to say, is this data complete? And once you click yes, and then click submit, then I know that you've completed it. So you can hit submit multiple times just to save your data. We encourage you to do that especially if you're getting information from multiple sources to complete this form. And that's also, again, to make it easier for you, so you don't have to collect all the data before starting to fill out the form. I want to talk a little bit about what this data is used for. The PUC completes several reports throughout the year. One is to the Federal Communications Commission. The Federal Communications Commission is required by Congress to report annually to Congress on the use of 911 fees by the states. And in order to complete that report, the FCC sends every state a data collection form that it would like each state to fill out. They send that to the governor's offices. They don't send it to the PUC directly, but they send it to each governor's office, and the governor of each state can determine who within the state government they want to fill it out. And for the last several years, that has been the Public Utilities Commission completing that form on behalf of the state of Colorado for the FCC. If we don't fill it out, that may actually preclude us, depending on how the rules of the grant are written, but that may preclude us from future federal 911 grant funds if we do not participate in that. But at the very least, it puts a black mark on that report for Colorado, because the FCC does report to Congress who completes the form and who doesn't complete the form, and states that don't complete the form get called out by the FCC in its annual report to Congress. Another report that we complete every year is a data collection effort by the National 911 Program Office, or you may know it as 911.gov. They do a data collection to each member of the National Association of State 911 Administrators. Currently, I serve as Colorado's representative to NASNA. And so each state fills that form out, and that form is used for a report that the National 911 Office does every year called the National 911 Progress Report. They publish that report on an annual basis, and it's used by industry as well as by the federal government to get a better handle on not just 911 fees, which is what the FCC focuses on, but what the progression of 911 technology across the country is. And that includes the degree to which next generation 911 and EZNets have been deployed. It used to focus more on wireless technology. Now it focuses more on NG911 and text to 911 deployment as well. So we use the data that we collect in here for that. Both of those are things that Colorado can or can't do if it chooses to. It kind of looks bad for Colorado if we don't complete those data collections. So we do every year, but those are not really mandatory. One thing that is mandatory for the Public Utilities Commission is the completion of the State of 911 report to the Colorado General Assembly. State statute requires that the PUC complete a State of 911 report and includes 7 different topic areas that have to be commented on in that report for the Colorado General Assembly. And a big portion of that is how 911 funds are being used in the state, how much is being collected in terms of 911 funds. And so one of the primary purposes of this data collection form is to help us gather the information we need to complete that State of 911 report to the legislature. Now, as I said, the state statute now requires the governing bodies respond to this data collection, this annual data collection. It doesn't provide any penalties for 911 governing bodies that don't participate in this data collection. However, because it is a requirement in state statute now, and because we are required to do a State of 911 report to the legislature, we'll be taking the same approach that the FCC does with its reports to Congress in reporting which 911 governing bodies participated in the data collection and which 911 governing bodies did not. So it may be kind of an embarrassment to not participate, but we try to make it as easy as possible so that it's not really, we're hoping that we don't really need a stick to get people to respond to this. Really the purpose of this is so that the legislature can be as informed as possible about the state of 911 funding in Colorado and what 911 funding is being used for. And the better informed they are, the better that is for 911 governing bodies in general when the legislature is considering issues related to 911 funding. So we hope that everyone will participate. But we'll be following up over the next few weeks to try to make sure that we get as close to 100% participation as we can. So with that, this is what the form is going to look like this year. The very first question is going to be pre-filled, as almost all of the fields will be pre-filled with your governing body name. If we got the name of your 911 governing body, or you may call it a 911 authority board, which I think is the more common term in Colorado still. If we got the name of your governing body wrong, feel free to update it when you get the form. Make sure that it is accurately reflective of your official name on your intergovernmental agreements or whatever other documentation you have for the governing body. Primary contact name. These will be going out to who we have as the primary contact. So if we don't get a response and we reach out and find out it's a different primary contact now, that'll be a good opportunity for you to update that information in this form. Primary contact phone number and email address. I think both of those are self-explanatory. Primary contact postal address. Not every governing body really has a PO box, but if you have one that you're using now for correspondence, it might be a PO box, it might be a street address. Whichever address you are using for correspondence for the governing body, we would appreciate that you put that in there. Finance contact email. You'll notice that all the ones we've had up till now have a red asterisk next to them. That means that they are mandatory. For finance contact email, that is not a mandatory item, but if you have a finance officer that you would like to be notified of incoming payments from the 911 Surcharge Trust Cash Fund, please include that email address here. As we started to roll out the state 911 surcharge and started to send out the distributions for that and started to send out advice letters telling every 911 authority what to expect each month in terms of how much they're getting from the state 911 surcharge, as well as from the prepaid 911 surcharge. We had a number of 911 governing bodies reach out to us and say, look, I'm the primary contact for the governing body, but I'm not who you need to tell to be looking for this money to be coming into our bank accounts. Here's our finance contact, if you wouldn't mind including them as well. So we created a new field for that, and just to keep that updated and make sure that financial information is going to the right person in your governing body, we ask that you include that information here. Remittance address. This was a suggestion, I think, from one of the 911 governing bodies that we have a list of the remittance address for every 911 governing body in the state. So if there's a company out there that one of the mom and pop VoIP companies or one of the smaller wireless companies, it could really be any of the telecommunications companies. If one of the telecommunications companies wants to verify that they are remitting their surcharges to the correct address for emergency telephone charges, we will have a list of those remittance addresses for each 911 governing body. Jeff, you have your hand up?
Yeah, and this is great because we use a separate lockbox PO box for our remittances.
Right. So your remittance address may be totally different than your primary contact postal address. So yeah, and that's one of the reasons we want to do it. We want to make that list of remittance addresses available online to the telecommunications providers so that they are, it takes away one more excuse for why we didn't get your emergency telephone charges to you. We didn't have the right remittance address. Well, now we're going to have one place online that we're going to store those remittance addresses. Jurisdiction description. This is actually from the statute. We request that you have that you provide us with a description of your collection area. This is not necessarily the same as the area served by your public safety answering points. This is the area that ETCs should be collected by the carriers and remitted to you. In lieu of that, or in addition to that, you can also provide a GIS shapefile. We provide the email address to send those shapefiles to. Our ultimate goal here, and we have a rudimentary version of this available on the Colorado 911 program website right now, but our ultimate goal is to have a very definitive online map that carriers can use, and actually to the point of being able to type in an address and getting information based on that address of which 911 authority should be receiving emergency telephone charges and what the rate should be for the customer at that address. So we have a rudimentary version of that online right now. We want to make it but we want to make it as accurate as possible. So by providing a description of your collection area, we can help refine that map. A shapefile is even better. We're not requiring that it be a shapefile at this point, simply because we know that not all of the 911 governing bodies have access to that or the ability to easily create a shapefile of their collection area. They may very well have shapefiles of their PSAP service areas, but as I mentioned, that's not always the same. That doesn't always coincide with the collection area. So we ask that you provide at least a verbal description of what your collection area is. ETC rate, this will already be filled in. I'm trying to keep these up to date in the database so that it should already be filled in with the most current ETC rate for your governing body. But if I missed it, if I didn't update it in this form, we ask that you go ahead and update it. This is also necessary because if it's above the amount that is established as the threshold by the Public Utilities Commission, you have to file an emergency telephone charge application. And we're going to talk about how to do that later. But if it's still at or below that threshold, you don't have to file an application, and there's nothing in the statute that says that you have to notify the commission. We ask that you notify the commission if you change your emergency telephone charge rate under that threshold, but there's no requirement that you do so. So just to make sure that we haven't missed anybody who increased their emergency telephone charge rate, we're going to ask that on an annual basis in this data collection form. PSAPs funded. So we want you to list all of the public safety answering points that are currently funded or partially funded by this 911 governing body. List each PSAP on a separate line. We give instructions if you use Shift-Enter, that will start a new line. Again, this will automatically be filled out for every 911 governing body, but we may not know all of the PSAPs that you fund. There may be some PSAPs that are funded by more than one governing body. In fact, I know that there probably are. So we want to make sure that we're being accurate in which PSAPs are funded by which 911 governing bodies. Total number of concurrent sessions. This is how many concurrent sessions all of your PSAPs combined are purchasing from CenturyLink, otherwise known as Lumen Technologies, from their EZNet tariff. This will be pre-filled based on the data that we received from CenturyLink/Lumen, but we're asking you as sort of an extra way to double check that that information is correct. So if the information we're getting from CenturyLink is different than the information you have on how many concurrent sessions you're purchasing, we want to follow up on that and make sure that we've got the correct amount. Now that is extremely important to you as a 911 governing body because you are getting reimbursed through the state 911 surcharge based on how many concurrent sessions you are purchasing. If we have an amount of concurrent sessions that is lower than what you are actually purchasing from CenturyLink, we want to know that so that we can get that corrected. There's actually an application form to increase the number of concurrent sessions that you are receiving reimbursement for through the state 911 surcharge fund. So if it turns out that there are any 911 governing bodies that are purchasing more concurrent sessions than what we have on our list, I can work with that governing body to make sure that it can file that application to increase the concurrent sessions that is being reimbursed for. There are a couple of governing bodies that don't have any PSAPs. They're paying another 911 governing body or paying a PSAP in another governing body's collection area to handle their 911 calls for them. If that describes you, then just enter 0. It should already say 0, but if it's blank or if it has any other number in there, enter 0 for your governing body, since you're not actually purchasing any concurrent sessions from Lumen directly. Total number of PSAP FTEs, so how many full-time equivalents are at each of the PSAPs or all of the PSAPs combined within your governing body. If you don't have any PSAPs, again, enter 0. One full-time employee is 1 FTE. A part-time employee that works 20 hours per week is half an FTE. Now, please notice that there's another question right after this. That's how many of those FTEs are funded with 911 funds. That's very different than this question. So this is how many FTEs are employed at all of your PSAPs combined, which not all of them may be getting funded through your local emergency telephone charge funds. This number is requested by the FCC report. It is also very relevant to the State of 911 report that the PUC completes for the Colorado General Assembly. Knowing how many FTEs we have in Colorado that are employed in 911 or in emergency communication centers is very important to knowing what the current status of 911 is in the state and what's happening with that over time. And then related to that, the next question is total FTEs funded with 911 funds. And I use terms very specifically here. So it's not just emergency telephone charge funds, but it's the prepaid 911 surcharge funds and the state 911 surcharge funds. The state 911 surcharge funds are calculated to reimburse you for what you're paying to CenturyLink every month for your concurrent sessions. But if there are any funds left above and beyond that, after you pay your CenturyLink bill, then you can use those funds for anything related to 911 per the allowable use list in statute. One of those things is personnel. You can use that to pay for personnel as well as your emergency telephone charge funds and your wireless prepaid funds. So however many FTEs are being funded with 911 funds is the answer we're looking for here, and that is for all of your PSAPs combined that you fund. And the reason why that's an important number, especially when you look at it in comparison to the one above, we want to be able to tell the General Assembly, well, first of all, this is a question that is asked on the FCC report that we do, but we also want to tell the General Assembly, this is how much personnel costs are statewide for 911, and this is how much of those personnel costs are being funded by 911 surcharge fees. And that gives them an idea of what the difference is and how much of those personnel costs are having to be made up for by other means, like through county and municipal funds, which are primarily then funded by sales taxes and property taxes or agency user fees. And I have a comment here from Joe Benkert. Says, are there any special instructions where employees are funded partly by ETC remittances and partly out of general funds? So that's exactly what we're trying to get at here, Joe, is so if you have a number of FTEs, you know how many of those FTEs you've got total, and then we can see how many of those FTEs are funded by 911 funds. So what I would say to your question, if they're partially funded by 911 funds, let's say that there are 12 employees total. Let's say it's a small 911 center. There's 12 employees total. And the 911 Authority Board decided at one point they're going to use 911 surcharge funds to fund 10% of those costs. Well, 10% of 12 full-time equivalents would be 1.2. So you're funding 1.2 FTEs. So that's what I would kind of hope to get. That's the kind of information that I would hope to get through this. I can add some additional instructions to this question to kind of provide that additional context on how to respond to this question, but I don't want to make it really difficult. So if it's something as simple as we're going to pay half of our personnel costs when you take your total FTEs and divide that by half, and that's how many that's the number that you would put into this question here as a response. Does anybody have any questions on that? I know that's a little wonky, but I'm hoping that it's not too difficult for people. Okay. Total call taker positions. This is the number of call taker workstation positions, not employees, but actual workstation positions in your PSAP. One of the questions that comes up, and this is a question that's on the 911.gov data collection, is how many actual call taker positions there are in the state. And so that's one of the questions we have here, and it's another piece of data that I'm asked for, not necessarily associated with an FCC data request or the National 911 Office data request, but just in general, is how many call taking positions are there in the state? And I don't really have the 911 Resource Center has collected that data in the past, but we haven't always gotten the great response rate on those surveys, so I don't really have a good solid number to provide to those responses. Jeff, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so is that equivalent to concurrent sessions then?
No. So concurrent sessions would be how many 911 calls you can take at a time, but number of workstations might be different. So let's say it's a small 911 center. You've got you could have 4 call taker positions. That's 4 actual workstations where people can take 911 calls at a time. But you might have 5 or 6 concurrent sessions because you want the ability to put, if you take a 911 call and it's not really an emergency, you want the ability to put that person on hold to answer the next 911 call and then come back to it later, right? So some 911 call centers might choose to have more concurrent sessions than they have workstations, or they might choose to have more workstations than they have concurrent sessions because they realize that they might also have call takers busy taking non-emergency calls that aren't coming over 911. So
That was
depending
kind of
on,
my question. That
yeah,
was kind of my question because, every position is capable of answering a 911 call, but dispatch positions don't normally do that unless.
right. And Joe says workstations could include backup, training, and test workstations. If all could be used to take live calls, do you want them listed? I should probably put some more information here. I'm really looking for what you're using for your normal operations. Yes, in an emergency, in a critical incident, you could expand the number of workstations fairly easily in some cases. Some places might have an EOC where all of the EOC workstations can also be used to take 911 calls, but that's not your normal operation. So I'll put some more context with this question. What I'm really looking for is how many call taking workstations are you utilizing in your normal operation? Are all of your PSAPs text to 911 capable? And your options here are yes, some, but not all, no, or not applicable. Not applicable would really just be for those 911 authorities that don't have their own PSAPs. Everyone else, it'll probably be yes, some, but not all, or no. I'm only aware of one 911 authority in the state that would answer with the some, but not all. Everyone else, I think, would probably fit in either the yes or no category. And we do keep track of this on the 911 program webpage already. We have a text to 911 map. This is really just to make sure that we are not missing anybody. If anybody activated text to 911 for their PSAPs and didn't inform us, this is an opportunity for them to let us know so that we can update that map. And again, it will be pre-filled with the information that we think is correct for your 911 authority. So this is just an opportunity for you to update that information if it's not correct. Total number of text to 911 calls processed. There's a possibility right now in the EZNet users group, there's discussion of a possible amendment to the CenturyLink Lumen EZNet tariff that would include a product called ECATS for every 911 governing body. And I think most of the people on this call have been participating in those discussions. You're already aware of that. Part of that ECATS product would collect text to 911 calls. I'm not entirely sure if that will include all of the PSAPs that are currently using browser-based solutions, because I'm not sure if ECATS has the capability of collecting that in some way if it's not coming through the CPE. So this is a way of us trying to collect the total number of text to 911 calls until we have a reliable method to collect that data automatically. And that is a question that's asked on the National 911 Program Office's annual data collection to the state 911 administrators. Right, and up till now, I've just had to leave that question blank. I don't have any data to put in there other than just a complete guess, which we don't want to do. So I'm hoping that if everybody responds to this with the total number of text 911 calls processed in the most recent calendar year, then I'll be able to provide that information to the National 911 Program Office in turn. Total spent by all PSAPs. This is total expenditure by all of your PSAPs combined for the most recent calendar year. This would include all operational and capital expenses. And this would include any expenses at the PSAPs that were paid for by the governing bodies. But it's not just expenses paid for by the governing body itself. We're trying to get an idea of what the total operational cost statewide is of providing 911 service. This is really a crucial question for not just the FCC annual data collection, but also for the State of 911 report that we do for the General Assembly. Getting a baseline of what the actual cost of providing 911 service is statewide, I think, is really a fundamental question in terms of knowing whether or not our current funding mechanisms like the emergency telephone charge and the state 911 surcharge are sufficient to that purpose. We know that that's not covering all of the costs, but this will help us get a general idea of how close to covering those costs we are. Joe says, is this limited to permissible expenses under state statute and FCC? So under state statute, I think that almost every expense within a public safety answering point would be an allowable expense under state statute. Under the FCC's new guidelines, all costs related to operating PSAPs are a permissible expense under the FCC's rules. So, really, I don't want to split hairs too much. I think pretty much every expense I can think of that would be under a PSAP budget would be included in that. And Jeff, you have your hand up.
So, for instance, JeffCom's budget, we fund a substantial amount of their budget, but certainly not the total thing. So, are we looking at their overall budget for the year, or?
Yes, we're looking for the total budget for the PSAP, not just the portion that's being funded by the governing body.
Okay, great, thank you.
Because that's the next question. And that is the next question. Percent of costs covered by 911 funds. You may not have an exact amount for this. We're looking for, if it has to be an estimate, that's fine, but you could do this simply by taking the amount of money that you're spending at the governing body on 911 expenses for each PSAP and divide that by the total operational budget for the PSAP, and that would give you that percentage. Matt?
I can't remember if this is in the questionnaire. Let's say we have a PSAP that's supported by 3 different 911 authorities. How do you address that in these questions?
We may have to do some work separately on that because I think that's a very unique situation, but we don't want to double or even triple count the expenses of a PSAP towards our statewide PSAP costs. So let me work with you offline on that because I think that's going to be a difficult one to crack, and we may need to separate it out like a third for each, or just one of them reports the expenses for that PSAP.
Mm-hmm. Right
on. Total 911 revenues, and this includes all revenues collected by the governing body from the emergency telephone charge, the wireless prepaid 911 surcharge, and the state 911 surcharge. Having looked at emergency telephone charge applications over the years, some governing bodies break these out in their budgets and some just lump them all together. We're just asking for a lump sum of all of the total 911 revenues that you received from those 3 funds, those 3 funding sources. Total amount spent on Next Generation 911. This is a really difficult question, and I hate to even ask it, but it is a question that we are required to or requested to provide a response to every year in the FCC's annual report. They ask how much was spent in the state on Next Generation 911. And the reason why I say this is a difficult question to answer is because lots of different things can be considered Next Generation 911. If you upgrade your phone system, maybe you upgrade your phone system not so much to facilitate Next Gen 911, but because you needed a new phone system. But if the phone system is also Next Generation 911 capable, or may make you more prepared for implementation of Next Generation 911, then it could potentially be included in this count. So I included some information here. It says this can include monthly recurring charges to Lumen for EZNet service, upgrading your phone systems, logging recorder, or other systems for Next Generation 911, or any other expenses related to preparation and operation of Next Generation 911 components. And Jeff, I saw you had your hand up for a second, or did your question just get answered?
You got it answered, thank you.
Okay. So it's not a really easy question. I'm not going to be coming back and saying, are you sure this is the right amount? We're just asking for you to make an estimate on this so that I can complete that response to the FCC. Same thing on total amount spent on cybersecurity. This is a really hard question to answer in some cases, but it is a question that the FCC asks every year, and they want to know just generally how much is spent on cybersecurity for 911 in the state. So we're asking that you let us know how much is spent, not just by your governing body, but by your PSAPs as well. So if you have PSAPs that are spending money on cybersecurity measures, even if they're not being reimbursed by the governing body, we'd like to include that. It can include cybersecurity monitoring at the PSAP, firewalls, training, or other cybersecurity related expenses. Matt, do you have your hand up?
I do. This one has always bothered me a little because I know that a portion of our EZNet monthly recurring charges includes some costs for EZNet cybersecurity, but we don't call that out by line item.
Right, and CenturyLink/Lumen has not disclosed, at least publicly, they did include, their costs when they filed the EZNet tariff, but they have not publicly disclosed how much they spend on cybersecurity as part of the EZNet. And it may not be even that easy for them to figure it out if we ask them, because they spend money on cybersecurity as a large multinational telecommunications company. How much of that can be attributed to 911 in Colorado might be hard for them to parse out. So I wouldn't expect anybody to include that. I would just include money that you're spending yourself on cybersecurity measures.
That's been my approach.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing you can do. I mean, because you have no way to know how much of your monthly EZNet charges is being used for cybersecurity. Did somebody else have a question? I thought I saw a hand up temporarily. Okay. 911 fee diversion statement. This is from Commission rules. We require that each 911 authority click this box on an annual basis to say that in the most recent calendar year, no 911 funds, including funds from local emergency telephone charges, the wireless prepaid 911 surcharge, or the state 911 surcharges were spent by the governing body on any items not allowed under 29.11.104, which is the section of statute that lists what those funds can be spent on. We ask this question for two purposes. One is that the FCC asks us every year, and in fact, it's the primary purpose of their report to Congress, if the state has misspent any 911 funds. Well, because all of 911 funds expenditures are done at the local level in Colorado, we have no way to answer that question unless we get information from you as to whether all of those funds were spent on allowable expenses. The other reason is for the State of 911 report. If we can honestly say to the General Assembly every year, all of the 911 authorities in the state have attested that they have only spent this money on eligible expenses, and it's still not enough, that increases the or shores up or strengthens any argument that may be made that 911 funding needs to be increased in other ways. If we say that 911 funding isn't enough to cover current expenses in Colorado, one of the first questions that may get asked is, well, are they spending it on the things that they're supposed to be spending it on according to statute? Being able to answer that question in the affirmative with no guesswork involved will go a long way towards answering that question. Does anybody have any questions about that one? And by the way, there is a link in the description to this question to that statute, so that you can double check what that list is. If you have any questions of what's included and what's not, there may be some gray area in there as well. We're not going to get down or split hairs and get into the weeds on that. If you believe that this is an accurate statement, we ask you to click that box saying that it's an accurate statement. Population served. One of the things that I would like to do at some point, because we know that there is an economies of scale with 911 service provision, not just in Colorado, but everywhere. There is a desire I think by a lot of people to see what does it cost on average to provide 911 service? And by asking what the population served is, we'll be able to give us a baseline of what it costs to provide 911 service per capita in the state and how that compares from one jurisdiction to another. This isn't to call out any jurisdiction for having particularly expensive 911 service, but it's meant to provide a baseline that we can use for future analysis. So we're asking that you provide a total population served by all of your PSAPs. Andrew?
Do you want us to only include permanent resident population, or try to suss out, population increases from tourists and people, especially the mountain towns, I'm thinking?
Yeah, that is a good question. I will put some more nuance around that. Let me think about that, because that is a question that comes up every time we talk about population served by a 911 center. And the problem with it is that it's very difficult for some communities to estimate what their transigent population may be, whether it's visitors or students, or even just transient populations. So I don't want to put anybody in a bind of having to do a huge transigent population study in order to answer this question, but I also don't want to undercount populations. So let me think about that a little more, and I'll put some more nuance in this population served description before I send it out. Jeff, you have your hand up?
You want to norm this anyway by like using what Google says for the current population of a particular area?
I didn't want to get into how you determine that. It could be Google, it could be the most recent census survey, which is where I think Google gets a lot of its information from anyway for populations. But if you have better information than what's available on Google or the most recent census, you can provide that as well.
I usually compare it to what the cities and counties come up with in their estimation.
Yep. And then comments. If you have any comments, sometimes these questions don't always provide a whole lot of ability for nuance. So I wanted to have one question that was just open-ended. If you have any comments that you would like to provide in addition to the information that you provided as part of this form, this is a field for you to do that. It's an optional field, but we'll use that to make the form better in future years, as well as to provide any additional nuance or useful information to the FCC or the National 911 Program Office when we fill out our reports to them. It could also be very important information to include in the State of 911 report. So this is your opportunity to let us know if there's any additional information that we need to be aware of when we're looking at this data. And you can also provide that as part of your responses to the earlier questions, but I wanted to give you one more opportunity to provide any additional information that you want to provide. And then the last question is data collection complete. And the reason I added this is so that if you're not done filling it out, but you want to save your data, you can click no and click submit and then come back to it later. As long as you have that original link that I send you by email, you can come back to the form with all of the data that you've already filled in and complete it at another time. This might be important if you're filling it out and you're like, well, I don't have the total number of call taker workstations at all of the PSAPs. I'm gonna have to reach out to my PSAPs and ask them. You can fill out the information you have, click no, the data is not complete, click submit, and then come back to it later by using the same link. And then once you do have all of the information in there, you click yes and hit submit. And that way we know you're done. You've completed your data collection for the year. So that's it. There's a few things that I need to provide some more nuance or information on, some more detail on, so that you know how to complete it correctly. And thank you for helping me kind of identify those questions so that I can work on those. But I'm hoping that this is not a really onerous task. This is something that we ask you to do once a year. It's not that different than the voluntary surveys that the Resource Center sent out in previous years, with just a couple of additional questions so that we can answer things that we haven't answered in the past for the FCC report and the National 911 Program Office report. If this does turn out to be onerous in any way. If there are particular questions that everybody has difficulty getting the information on, for example, we can look at whether there's a way to reword that question or maybe even just eliminate it. Because I don't want this to be something that you spend hours and hours on. But I am asking for your help in providing responses to the federal agencies that ask us for information. And I think even more importantly to the Colorado General Assembly, because they are making decisions on legislation that directly relates to 911. And I want them to do that on the basis of accurate, complete, and up-to-date information. Jeff?
And when do you expect you'll release it, and when will it be due?
I will probably release it sometime in the next week. Like I said, based on our conversation today, I need to do some work on a couple of these questions and provide some additional instruction. So it probably won't be in the next couple days, but maybe within the next week. Whenever I get it out, I will give everyone at least a full month to complete it. And I'm not going to just sit there and wait a full month and see what the responses are. I'll be checking in like weekly to send out reminders to anybody who hasn't started it yet. I'm not doing this to annoy you. I'm doing this so that you don't forget, because I know how busy you are. I used to work in a PSAP myself, so I know how busy you are, and I don't want it to just fall off your radar. Scott?
Thanks, Daryl. And I'm sorry I was late, so I don't know if you already covered this, but right there on the cybersecurity question. So we do not, out of the 911 fund, spend any money on cybersecurity yet, but our general fund cybersecurity team helps support them. But then later this year, we will start looking. Should we calculate for this answer to say what the general fund is paying, or do you want just what the 911 fund would be paying?
No. So what I would need is for the FCC report, I need the total amount that's being spent, whether the money is coming from the governing body or from the PSAPs. So the way I have it worded here is enter the total amount spent by your governing body or any of your PSAPs in the most recent calendar year. I should probably add or agencies that support those PSAPs, because maybe it's not the PSAP itself spending the money, maybe it's the county IT department. But if it's being spent on behalf of the PSAP for 911 cybersecurity or cybersecurity of the 911 call center, that would be included in the information that I need for the FCC, because that's what the FCC wants. They want to know the total amount that's being spent on 911 cybersecurity in a state. And without you providing that information, I just have no way of collecting that data.
Cool, thank you.
So I will add some additional clarity to the instructions for this question as well. Jeff?
And so, for JeffCom, it's pretty easy because it's standalone, but for like the city and county of Broomfield, I'm sure they spend money on cybersecurity, but a portion of that supports the PSAP. How should we try to parse that out, or should we?
I would ask them just for a rough estimate of how much is being spent on cybersecurity for the PSAP, because they may not break it out in their budget. They may have cybersecurity expenses for the entire county or for the whole city. And it may not be broken out for the PSAP, but if they can provide you with an estimate at least of how much of that money is being spent on behalf of the public safety answering point, I think that may be as close as we're going to be able to get to a solid answer.
And I'm trying to think of how we would parse that, if it's by workstations or personnel, or I guess.
Well, so if they're spending a certain amount on cybersecurity for the whole county, and when you know how many employees are at the PSAP versus how many employees are in the whole county, maybe you can use that to derive a percentage.
Yeah.
In that way, and then apply that percentage type to the total amount to get an estimate. On some of these things, all I can do is ask you to provide your best guess, or I don't want to call it a guess, but your best informed estimate. Because in the past, I've just not been able to answer these questions for the FCC. I'd like to be able to start giving them some responses on these questions, but at the same time, I'm relying on you, and I don't want to make it too onerous. So whatever you can do to provide an estimate without going into, I don't expect anybody to do like a full audit of the expenses to determine how much is being spent at the PSAP. But if you can do something that is not that onerous to provide an estimate, it would be appreciated.
Etherports per parsec.
What's that?
ether ports per parsec.
per parsec.
Yeah,
That's what the Kessel run was made in.
exactly.
How many parsecs? I don't remember. Anyway,
Kobayashi Maru. Yeah.
see, now you're mixing your shows. So anybody have any other questions or comments regarding this data collection? And honestly, if you think it's too onerous, I want to know that too. You're not going to hurt my feelings. If you feel like this questionnaire is too cumbersome, is going to require too many man hours to complete, person hours, I should say. I want to know that too, so that we can make it better in future years, because the more difficult it is, the more likely it is that some jurisdictions may skip it or just not respond, and I don't want that. That doesn't help us. So if there are ways that we can make it easier, ways that we can make it better. Some of these questions you're answering for the first time, so they're going to be blank this time, but in future years, they'll already be filled in and you just have to update them. So I'm hoping that also helps make it better. But if there are things that we can do to improve on this and make it easier for you, I want to know that as well. All right. We got that done in our allotted half hour. The rest of my time today, I was going to spend on providing an overview of how to apply for an emergency telephone charge application. Let me get that presentation started. And by the way, this is being recorded. I plan on taking this webinar and breaking it up into 2 pieces. There'll be a half hour, the half hour just for the data collection program, and then we'll have a separate video, a separate webinar download just for the ETC application, so that whichever one you're interested in learning about, you can just